Today I want to speak about alternate routes, and the reason why I want to speak about that is because the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz is now having an impact far beyond what people could have imagined. So now let's look at the map. This is the main traffic which goes across all over the world from Strait of Hormuz. But more importantly, if you look at this map shows you the alternate routes. For example, Saudi Arabia, one of the biggest suppliers of oil, used to take this route for its oil export because this is blocked right here, Strait of Hormuz. So they have a pipeline overland which is called the East-West pipeline. It carries 7 million barrels per day, clearly nowhere near what they used to send from this route. This oil is offloaded here at the Yanbu port. Tankers most likely come from here, Red Sea, take the oil and then move through the Suez Canal onwards. Abu Dhabi has a pipeline, but clearly it doesn't have enough capacity. Bab al-Mandab, right here, the mouth of the Red Sea, 2.47 million barrels per day, which has seen an increase of 330%. So this is essentially the route that we are looking at, but there's the severe capacity issues right here. Moving on. Now, this shows you exactly where the problem is being created, because if you look at shipping, this is the Strait of Hormuz, this right here is the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab, and because this is the shortest route for shipping, all the ships that come from here, from Asia, they would come here, pass through here and through the the Suez Canal and onwards. But now because of the uncertainty here, they have to take this long route via the Cape of Good Hope. 9.1 million barrels per day have passed here. The problem with this route, of course, is not just that it is much more expensive, the freight charges go higher up, but the time that it takes, the extra time, about 2 weeks or so of travel time, so that becomes very problematic. And of course, this is some more data. This chart actually shows you how the traffic is being disrupted. The Suez Canal traffic, if you see, gone from 49 to 23 ships. The Bab al-Mandab route, which is this one, the green one, you can see here, it begins to get all haphazard. This is a time where there's a lot of disruption and uncertainty because of the Houthis there, and all of this is disruption. This is the Cape route, as you can see, very low, again, because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, freight and especially the time that it takes. But then, when disruptions happen in other routes, this begins to go up. And suddenly you can see now in 2025 and now 26, this is peaking. This essentially means that there is a lot of disruption happening everywhere. The bottom line is that there are alternate routes available. They are being used, but they cannot carry the kind of supply that is required by the world economies, which essentially means that even though these routes provide some relief, without the Strait of Hormuz, the supply of oil and shipping will remain disrupted. So we've been discussing the latest situation as we talked about earlier, there is this element of uncertainty about when the talks will take place in Islamabad and whether they will actually happen or not. Of course, conventional wisdom says that it is in the interest of both the US and Iran that they do come to Islamabad, sit across the table and try and find a way out of this conflict. But while this is happening, the worst affected area or the core of the area, the general areas that are being affected is the Strait of Hormuz and the shipping traffic which has been completely disrupted, leading to a massive ripple effect across the globe. Today, in this story, I would like to speak a little bit more in terms of how that shipping traffic is being impacted and what could it lead to in the short to medium term, and specifically how will it affect Pakistan, and also if there are any hidden opportunities if this status quo breaks and remains broken in so many ways in the months to come. And to discuss this, I am joined by a guest who knows this topic inside out, Uh, Joining me is Mr. Matthew Wright. He is the principal freight analyst at Kepler, which is of course a leading data and analytics company, and it provides real-time intelligence on global commodity flows. Mr. Wright specializes in oil tanker markets and maritime freight analysis, and of course he's an expert commentator on shipping disruptions. He's been talking about the Strait of Hormuz and the conflict there in a number of international channels. So we are very honored that Mr. Wright joins us today. Mr. Wright, welcome to our show. So today, of course, as I was mentioning, there is an element of uncertainty about the talks, but there is nothing uncertain about the situation in the Straits of Hormuz. What is the state of ships and tankers right now? What is happening? Where are they parked? What's going on there?
Yeah, great question. So as it is right now, there's very little traffic going in or out. We are seeing the occasional vessel, but for the last, today and on Sunday, we've seen maybe 2 vessels either entering or exiting. But this is, there's been a lot of noise and a lot of mixed messages. On Friday afternoon, we had that tweet from the Iranian foreign minister that said, the Strait of Hormuz is open. Immediately, dozens of vessels that have been trapped in the Mideast Gulf for weeks and weeks rushed towards the Strait of Hormuz. And they got towards the Strait of Hormuz, and then they were radioed by the Iranian army, the IRGC, the Navy, and told to turn around. So you have the politicians saying it's open, and then you have the Navy, the army saying actually it's not. So a lot of those vessels turned around. Now, as it was over Saturday morning, from around midnight Saturday through to early Saturday morning, we did see a large number of vessels exit. We saw 24 vessels leave, moving in and out of the Mideast Gulf. That's the most we've seen since the war began. But then a tanker, the Sanmar Herald, which was an Indian tanker with an Iraqi cargo on board, was shot at by an Iranian gunboat, and then all traffic has ceased again. And this is a continuation of the situation that we've basically seen for the last couple of months. There's some hope, some building confidence that maybe this time the market is opening up, and then our hopes are dashed, and transits drop back down. So fundamentally, transits are what we want to be watching. That is what matters to the market. And only at the moment, they're still very, very low.
And this incident which happened last night, where an Iranian tanker was intercepted by American naval forces, they boarded it. Last report suggests they have it in their control. What kind of an impact has that had on the market?
Yeah, so this is the first confirmation that the US really are enforcing the blockade. So we've got sort of 2 situations. You've got the Iranians controlling the Strait of Hormuz, and then you've got the US controlling the Gulf of Oman. So the entrance there, if you can imagine a line being drawn from the Omani coast through to the eastern side of Iran. And they arrested this vessel. It was a container vessel looking to enter, moving into the Gulf of Oman towards the Strait of Hormuz. And as you said, they've as far as we've been aware, they took control of the vessel. So this is confirmation that there is a blockade, and they are enforcing this. And so far, the blockade from the US point of view has been broadly successful. We haven't seen any confirmation of Iranian crude, for example, leaving the region. And that is significant. Iran has been the only country to continuously maintain exports throughout the war. But up until now, that looks like that is coming to a halt for the time being, at least.
Do we have any idea of how many tankers are stranded in the Strait of Hormuz? How many are in port? Are there any which left the port but now can't go back and are in open waters? Do we have any information about all of this data?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, when it comes to there's close to 1,000 vessels trapped in the Mideast Gulf. Hundreds of tankers and dry bulk vessels. For the tankers' point of view, the vast majority of them are loaded. A lot of them that got stuck in the region subsequently were then booked to load cargoes. And this was just to help facilitate port facilities and actual limitations in terms of storage at a lot of the ports. So there is a large, almost all of the largest tank vessels are actually in the Middle East Gulf are actually loaded, and they're waiting. They're sitting there with millions and millions, hundreds of millions of barrels of crude, refined products waiting to be loaded. Majority of them are not at ports. They're at anchorages, sort of in and around, across the Middle East Gulf. A lot of them are stationed off the UAE, obviously towards the exit, towards the entrance to the Strait, in anticipation of some reopening, and given the chance to exit. Obviously, these vessels have been stuck in a war zone for 8 weeks, and so understandably, they're very eager to leave.
And how is that impacting alternate routes? For example, the Red Sea route or other avenues. Are we seeing a lot of traffic being diverted there? And is that helping in any way? Or is the supply, the demand outstripping supply so much that the impact could be negligible?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, we've definitely seen a huge amount of changes in terms of trade flows, and from a vessel's point of view, massive changes. The Middle East Gulf accounts for over 50% of VLCC. These are the very large crude carriers, the largest tankers that carry vessels cargo over long distance. Without the Middle East Gulf, there really isn't much opportunity elsewhere. So we are seeing a big shift. The Red Sea has been a key one. The Saudi Arabia exports between 4.5 million barrels a day from Yanbu in the Red Sea, and that has been ramped up and is providing an outlet. We're also seeing a lot more inquiry from the US, West Africa, Latin America. A lot more of that crude is going east. But there's just simply not enough. The world doesn't balance without the Middle East Gulf. So we are at a point now where, countries, particularly in Asia, are drawing down on their inventories. But there is a limitation to how much longer they can do that for.
How soon would the aviation airline industry be impacted? Because we're constantly hearing about the shortage of jet fuel, and that, especially in Europe, the reservoirs are depleting very quickly. So if this continues for maybe a couple of weeks or more, how serious would the situation be for aviation industry?
Yeah, it's incredibly serious. I would say, for Europe, the jet fuel really is the major pinch point, and diesel, of course. I think estimates range between 40 to 50 days in terms of cover. They are able to source jet fuel from alternative locations. Europe is bringing now in jet fuel from West Africa, but the Middle East Gulf is such a huge provider of European jet fuel. It is driving prices higher and making availability very, very tight. But absolutely, unless we see some change in the situation, we're going to see ever higher jet fuel prices, and potentially come later in the summer, some flight cancellations.
So that situation, of course, is getting very, very serious. Now, Mr. Wright, I want to turn to the long-term or mid-term impacts of this conflict, specifically on shipping, on insurance, on freight. What do you foresee in the short to medium term that could happen?
Yeah. So on the from a tanker's point of view, it's incredibly detrimental to demand. There just simply isn't enough cargo to go around. So we're expecting, if this were to persist, I think, just to be clear, it could reduce tanker demand by around 15 to 20% annually. But compared to the impact that we would see on economies, particularly in Southeast Asia and Africa, there's far more significant. Fundamentally, just the loss of refined products, LPG, gasoline, diesel. We're going to see real substantial impacts in terms of economic growth across Asia and Africa.
And now, one of the outcomes is that ports like Karachi and Port Qasim, two important ports in Pakistan, are receiving a lot of traffic. I was looking at some data, Mr. Wright, and it says that in the last 1 month, the amount of traffic that we've had there is more than what we normally have in a year. So obviously, this major disruption is causing traffic in places like Pakistan and to increase, which obviously is good for Pakistan, which obviously it's not, I feel bad saying that because, one shouldn't be, taking advantage of a conflict, but that's the way economies work, that's the way shipping and traffic works. So do you see that in the long term, the way that shipping was being done through the Straits of Hormuz will now fundamentally change and there'll be no going back to the way things were, and that there are opportunities for places like Pakistan which are very strategically placed in this region and can of course do much more with their ports?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you explained it exactly right there. Pakistan is, those ports are very, very well placed when it comes to the current situation. They're sufficiently outside of the area of the conflict, which provides vessels with, a sort of safe haven, but while still being within the proximity of the Middle East. It's obviously, being able to anticipate what's going to happen in the Mideast Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz is incredibly difficult, but it does feel like this could be a fundamental change in the way that, traffic operates there. I think we do all hope that the situation will be resolved and, just for the global economy, that we're able to return to a normal transit. I think, unfortunately, if we sort of remain in the status quo, which is essentially Iranian permitted and Iranian controlled transits, we will never get back to historic levels, like pre-war levels of transits that are required to export the products and the crude and the dry bulk, the fertilizers that the global economy needs. So, yeah.
So finally, is there any alternative to the Straits of Hormuz? And of course, what I mean is that the dependency on this area for shipping, for energy requirements, in the short term, we all know, the alternatives do not provide the same kind of traffic that the Strait of Hormuz can produce. But looking ahead, do you think this is a time where countries will think that they need an alternative, and are there any alternatives that can be developed over the coming years?
Certainly over the coming years, but you're absolutely right. In the short term, unfortunately not. And I think the real concern is the time required to for the economy to adjust to a loss in at least some substantial percentage of Middle East exports would cause significant damage to global growth. So, my view is we will get to higher levels. I do think we do need to anticipate that the market seems to be anticipating that at any moment the strait could open. But I think we should be aware that there's a huge amount of distrust on both sides for both the Americans and the Iranians. And from a shipper's point of view, that doesn't, embolden much confidence. So even if there was an announcement today that a deal had been struck between the two sides, I think we're looking at least 1 to 2 months. We'll see a lot of vessels exit the Mideast Gulf rapidly. But to get back to real levels of shipper confidence where vessels want to re-enter the Mideast Gulf, I think it's going to take a number of months. The insurance industry is going to want to see a long period without attacks. And then, of course, there's the time to repair all of the damaged infrastructure in the Mideast Gulf, which is going to take 6 to 12 months.
So we are looking at enhanced costs for sure.
Absolutely.
Mr. Matthew Wright, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your analysis with us. Of course, as I was saying, every crisis has an opportunity, and given the kind of traffic that we are attracting at our ports, clearly there is a opportunity and a potential. Much can be done. We hope that it will be done. And now, before we close, a little bit about how it feels to be a Pakistani nowadays.